Well, thank you everyone that's joining us from all over the world. Really pleased to have you on board. And we've reached the magic 100 number of attendees, and that will gradually grow. Just to let you know, this event is being recorded and we will be sharing it on our YouTube channel for anyone that can't stay for the whole amount, or you want to share it with your colleagues, or if you're a lecturer or a student. So that will be available afterwards. We will be using the chat box for questions, and we'll put those to Lauren at the end. Many of you may not be aware that in addition to office furniture, Herman Miller is also a provider of furniture for the healthcare industry, but also the world of higher education. And this is an area that we have also done research in, and one of our leading sharers of that research is Lauren Bell, who is joining us now. Lauren, the floor is yours. Over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate it. So I lead Herman Miller's education team, and in Europe we've done some really interesting work and attended some really interesting events, both pre and post pandemic. So I will do my best to share as many new insights as I can. Essentially, I'm sharing today a lot of considerations that we're seeing globally that seem to be requested by clients, talked about by architects, researched in depth by either us or people in the industry or outside of the industry. So lots of data gathering. This presentation is constantly evolving. So your input is really always appreciated, and certainly would like to discuss these topics in more depth if you have particular questions. So again, I'm sharing today considerations for design best practice, considerations, or a lot of considerations around the student experience and best practices around that. Of course, always leading to design, because that's what we do. So we know that the campus is a place for discourse and growth, the development of knowledge and home and identity. Today we'll talk about how the campus has shown resilience, especially the past 2 years, how we can become ready for our return to campus when we are on site, and what design looks like to prepare us for success. So I'm just sharing a quote from our head of design in the 60s, Robert Probst. He said, "Not only must we accept change, we must adjust to accelerated growth." And I thought, this is just a nice thought-provoking statement that is so true of what has happened the past 2 years. At universities, you probably knew a lot of the things that would come in the future, but they've just been accelerated and they're here now and they're happening now. So we'll discuss that, and we'll discuss some best practice and what we're seeing all around the globe. So instead of just being at home and on campus, we're seeing resilient campuses work across a distributed network of environments successfully. So distributed ways of working and learning, where people are empowered to work and learn at different times and places. These aren't new, but they've been super accelerated, as we've discussed already, by the pandemic. So dynamic working and learning is happening across time and place and in collaboration with technology, and the learning experience is becoming more community focused. We're also seeing lots more interprofessional and interdisciplinary education taking place, with lots of other parties now involved in the learning experience, from community members to industry experts, potential employers as well, and just other disciplines are now involved in the learning experience of any given student. And this is happening digitally, in hybrid ways, and in person as well. So yes, I will go into depth on pedagogy and design, but first I will talk about staff and faculty as our first group of stakeholders that I like to kind of mention before we discuss kind of what designs work well for them. So when designing for staff and faculty, we always start with 6 basic needs. This is from global research that Herman Miller has done, and it's a nice thought-provoking, thought-starting point to assess a design brief when we're designing for staff and faculty. So you may disagree with some of these needs, you may add to them, you may have your own list, but it's important when we discuss staff and faculty to think about what they need now, maybe as opposed to before the pandemic, and how design can support these needs. So I think before the pandemic, people were most concerned with, or during the pandemic, people were most concerned with security. At least our clients were, and now it's more about autonomy and sense of belonging and sense of purpose. So it's really interesting to talk to staff and faculty about what's important to them upon their return to campus. And this list is just where I always start to get an idea of what they need. So on that topic, a couple of reasons why people want to come back to the workplace, and this is again from our global research we've done recently. Conduct internal teamwork, cross-functional teamwork, focus work, the usage of tools and equipment, devices, resources, to experience culture, to be social, and to create division between work and life. So in a survey of hundreds and hundreds of university staff, Herman Miller found that upon the return to being on site and on the physical campus, university staff and faculty overwhelmingly selected well-being and supporting well-being as the most important factor that we should consider when they return to campus, and designing spaces that then also increase productivity, inspire creativity, foster collaboration, spaces that are student serving, and spaces that model the future. So again, if you are interested in any of these pieces of content in more detail, I'd be happy to send you that survey and all of the gory details that are underneath each question, but this is just a brief highlight of that survey, so we thought that was interesting. So campus workplaces to remain purposeful, we note that they need to help people to do their best no matter where or when they are working. At our company, we say, for example, it's okay to make a beautiful mess. So is this the case within your workplace culture on your campuses? Is it okay for staff to work in their own way where they are most productive? I know some of us in our office are messier than others, but at the end of the day, we have a clean desk policy. So there's lots of policies like that that are coming into play with more hot desking spaces on campus. It'd be interesting to hear from you if you have policies like that and how you support everybody's personal and unique work styles, because there's a lot more unassigned workstations now, of course. We're seeing a lot more settings or requests for settings from our clients to facilitate immersive teamwork, and I'll dive into that a little more. But immersive teamwork is essentially when a department comes on site for maybe, let's say, a week, and then the rest of the month, they are off-site or in distributed environments of their choosing. And then next month, they'll come back on site for a week. I know a few European institutions are doing this. I wonder if you are, and it would be interesting to get your feedback on that model. So let's move on to students. So with students, a few things that we know about students: they want to participate and collaborate. They want to work privately while still having others present. They value technology and having it accessible. And sometimes they just want to relax. Students want to be treated as adults, so they tell us. They're attracted to what's current, fresh, and unexpected. They gravitate towards experience and hands-on exploration, and they prefer places that they can control, change, modify, pull apart, and put back together. So students have recently reported that they are willing to pay more for an in-person campus experience than they would for a 100% online experience. And most students, according to research done by Gensler and others, most students do want the choice to have a hybrid learning experience, and I'll dive into what that looks like in a minute. So the student experience is extremely important to us, and when we design with students in mind, we're always thinking how design can impact their overall experience. And again, I'll get to design considerations in the last section of this presentation. But in 2019, we had a fantastic research roundtable, and we really focused on the student experience. We had 26 leaders from European institutions come to discuss how design can impact the student experience. And we settled on 5 key aspects that we found to be extremely important, and perhaps at you might think, well, actually I have 6 elements that are really important, or I wouldn't use any of these, I have my own list. As I say, I'm always evolving this presentation, so do let me know what you think are the most important elements of the student experience. Here we have basic needs, as I already mentioned for staff, they're just as important for students. Sense of belonging, learning outcomes, workplace readiness, and sense of ownership. So I'll dive into each of these really briefly, but again, this is 2019, and I've really found it interesting to compare what we thought then to now. So basic needs, we've already discussed that in terms of the staff, and when you're starting a design brief, thinking about starting with basic needs is always a good idea, in my opinion, to kind of assess what's most important to students and describing them as basic needs that we absolutely need to support in order for any spaces that we provide to be successful. So let's chat about sense of belonging. There are so many different aspects of design that can directly impact sense of belonging. I'll give one example. The image here is from the North Carolina State Hunt Library in the US that I had the privilege of working on a few years ago. And it's a really good example of what I've seen work throughout the world, really. And one example is students said, especially first-year students, I really want to walk into this building and be greeted by a student-run team. I want an Apple Store style experience, like a Genius Bar experience that you would get at an Apple Store. I want to walk up to people and be at eye level. And I want, it to be very clear. The signage needs to be so clear as to where I must go and what I must do. And I don't want to travel too far to get there. And on the right, you can't really see, but there's a ribbon, digital ribbon coming from ceiling to floor that has the university's Twitter feed constantly scrolling on it. And there's just a range of different signage, constantly updated information, and the university logo is everywhere. And students did report a increased sense of belonging. And of course, that's a subjective thing to measure, but all we can do is assess and ask students and observe and see what works. And so centralizing student services and assessing, okay, what services can we have that are student run, and how can we increase that sense of comfort and belonging for students, especially those first-year students. This would have been an example of that. And there's so many others as well. So learning outcomes, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but this could be, for example, grades. How can design impact the student experience in the classroom to therefore improve grades? We have done a couple of projects on that. It's really complicated, obviously, to prove that design directly impacts grades. But if you're curious for some reports on that, I'm happy to share some with you. What I'm mostly concerned about today, and some of you may have attended the recent European Innovative Learning Spaces Conference in Berlin or online, there was a lot of talk on competency-based learning. And we've been talking about this for a while, assessing the workplace readiness skills list that the World Economic Forum puts out there every couple of years. And it's really interesting to see kind of what skills employers are looking for today and what they perceive there needs to be in the future. And it's interesting to compare what's needed today versus what was needed back in 2015, for example. And there are a variety of ways that institutions are incorporating these skills into the way that they measure if pedagogies are working well or not well, and they're seeing that students value the assurance that they're going to develop these skills over the assurance of good grades. So that's quite an interesting concept. So this is a visual from the SP Jain School of Management in Dubai. They have developed their own software to ensure that they are developing key workplace readiness skills within their classes. So here's an example of what a student's phone screen might look like when they're seeing where they are in comparison to their classmates within these particular key areas, such as critical thinking, business intelligence, and effective communication. And if you have any, if you'd like to discuss that further, I can happily send you a video of this. And I think it was the Copenhagen Business School and the Holt College of Business at this conference 2 weeks ago, both said they were also looking into competency-based learning in this way, which is really interesting. So, in terms of assessing space and thinking about incorporating skills development and assessing if place impacts skills development, which of course I believe that it does, there are a variety of ways to go about it. I always suggest doing a pilot classroom before you do a bigger project, to experiment with different layouts, different furniture, technologies, resources, pedagogies, to assess what works for you and what meets the goals you're trying to achieve. So when I think about impacting student skills, I do try to ask these questions when I've done a pilot classroom to assess if it's worked or not, and compare that to just maybe their previous classroom when I asked the same questions. So, do you feel more comfortable asking questions in this room versus that room? Do you feel able to discuss an issue from multiple perspectives? Do you feel comfortable making persuasive arguments in a public speaking setting? Does the space allow you to successfully form new ideas? There are so many statements you could ask the students to agree or disagree with on a scale of 1 to 10. For example, that's one way of doing it, and that has worked well for me. It has been a really good way to assess if space is working and improving specific skills. So this is just a small set of questions, but I'd be curious as to what questions you would ask to determine if certain skills are being impacted by space. So overwhelmingly at that research roundtable in 2019, a sense of ownership was the top way that our leaders determined that we could tell if a space was successful. They said if they could determine that students had a sense of ownership of a space, that is the best way to say that space is designed really well. That's a success. So I'd be curious if you agree with that. So some ways and observations that we thought could be good for assessing if there's a sense of ownership. Do the students return to the learning spaces after classroom to collaborate? Do the students hack the furniture in these spaces to suit their needs? Do they make a creative mess? Do they use forgotten spaces? And those spaces were brought to my attention by design students who said, look, we've got this fantastic business school that was just built on our campus, but there's so many forgotten spaces that we could use for phone booths and, you know, standing height kind of touchdown points. Could we do a forgotten spaces project? And since then, I always include forgotten spaces in my evaluations of a building. But yes, these are just a couple of examples. And then another one is, do the students shift positions and settings during class time? I know that in some places, the longest lecture might be up to 4 hours long in my experience. And so within that room, or that class, is there a sense of comfort with just changing position, changing setting to maybe go to a standing height setting halfway through the class? I'd be curious as to if that's something that you've seen and if students feel comfortable with just simply getting up and changing position as we do in the workplace. So pedagogy, this has been obviously the biggest change in the past 2 years. Obviously, we knew hybrid learning. We were doing hybrid learning in many ways, but now it's so accelerated. And students are reporting that they want hybrid learning as a choice. They don't want it to be fully online or fully in person all the time. They want the choice. And that's no surprise, as they've had a consumer mindset for a long time. So when they are on site, students report that they want to do a lot of hands-on learning, that they appreciate smaller class sizes. And again, Gensler has some fantastic content on this on their blog. So I'll send you the link to Gensler's Research and Insights blog, where they've done a student engagement, education engagement index that I found really interesting. So you can kind of see the ratio of what students want in terms of the pedagogies they are looking for when they look for a university. And here's an example. Here's just a visual from Gensler's book. So, you know, it says here, all learning modes suffered as a result of the pandemic, and a staggering 44% of students feel less successful academically than they did prior to the pandemic. So they have a effectiveness gauge here, and you can kind of see March 2021 compared to pre-COVID, what they were wanting out of their pedagogies. So again, I'll share that link with you in my follow-up email. Another place I've been getting some really good information is the Perkins-Eastman Learning Futures Report for 2025 and predictions for what education will be like in 2025. So let's move to design and some trends that we're seeing, and also requests that we're getting from clients. Again, these are what we're seeing ourselves, what we're reading about, and considerations that we've interpreted from current trends as well. So feel free to ask questions. I'll do my best to answer. So I stole this image because my sister is actually launching these Amazon Fresh stores throughout the world. And Teresa, I just saw your question there. It's the Perkins-Eastman Learning Futures 2025 report. I will send it to you. So Amazon Fresh, you walk in, you don't have to take out your wallet at any point. The cart automatically detects what you're buying and adds it to your Amazon account. Now, this is what students will be thinking about as they enter any area of their lives, including the on-campus experience. And it's also in terms of sanitization and the topic of COVID, makes them feel more secure to have a hands-free experience when possible. So lots of measures have been taken to create a more hands-free campus in terms of room reservation, thinking about the future of how students will buy groceries, thinking about how to do anything they need to do with minimizing touch. That's been an interesting trend we've seen. Now, other trends, kind of leading more into design and furniture here, we're seeing design briefs shift away from rows and rows of tables to more personalized and individual seating. And that includes personalized, personal laptop tables that you would bring up to use. And this makes people feel more secure and comfortable, gives them the freedom to position themselves to see the virtual learners who may be calling in to a hybrid session. And yeah, it certainly just gives people more of a sense of personal space. We are also seeing a lot more requests for informal learning spaces, both at university, but also in the workplace. So my personal definition of that would be learning that is not within four walls. So certainly informal learning, maybe impromptu learning, and really hands-on and active learning. So a few images of that. You can kind of see on the right-hand side here, we have a workplace setting on the left, and then a presentation sort of setting on the right with soft seating in the front. This is an example from one of our large corporate clients where they wanted an informal education setting in the middle of their workspace, and they can reconfigure it in these various ways. Plus, you have varied heights there as well, so to help with line of sight. Team and individual learning. Now, I mentioned earlier immersive teamwork, and I'll mention it probably twice more. Whether it's happening or not on your campus, it is an interesting thing to think about when you have teams coming on campus for that immersive experience. If you're on campus for a week and then you go and be dispersed for the rest of the time, you still need individual places to do some focused work, even if you're on campus with your team. So we're trying to incorporate individual settings within team settings where possible. Hybrid learning, we could do a whole presentation just on hybrid learning today, of course. So if you'd like to continue this discussion with me, I'd be more than happy to. We've got many different examples of hybrid learning and working spaces. So hybrid learning spaces, our clients are requesting spaces that are easy to move around, but not too easy, because you don't want them to look a mess. So, and you don't want too much technology that they're anchored to the floor. So agile, movable pieces with some fixed pieces that offer you the chance to sit or stand and have line of sight to virtual students is key. So we've seen rooms like this before, but just having some settings that are just standing height that you cannot move are actually preferred by many of our clients. And I would suggest maybe 1 or 2 tables with electric height adjustability for those wheelchair users. So you don't want to sacrifice any design aesthetic, but it functions just a little bit better for some users who need that. Further hybrid learning spaces, these are actually all from corporate examples and renderings, but again, you see those personal spaces, not rows and rows of tables. You see an individual space in the bottom left-hand corner for a lecturer, potentially, to come onto campus and have everything they need to be able to conduct a good online presentation, because we may not all have the luxury of that kind of space at home. We're still seeing lots of requests from clients to create social spaces, which is great, and it's what people are craving. We know that, but we keep getting told by students and faculty and staff, please create as many social spaces as possible. So we've already discussed teamwork spaces and providing an area for focus within that space. And of course, we have to think about acoustic protection in those areas as well. A lot of people do not need an enclosed room, but just some acoustic protection is helpful. So individual settings for focus can completely range from totally acoustically protected to just an individual desk, but within a busy area where you can put on some sound cancelling headphones and be perfectly happy, or you need to go to a pod. And it's really interesting how many requests we're getting for these, because we have, especially in cities, I would say, a lot of universities are saying, we're a city university, our students are not going to go home halfway through the day because they don't live nearby, so they'd like to be on campus and kind of roam around between classes for the entire day. They do need a lot of space to attend an online lecture and focus, and they find it hard being in a city to not have space where they can focus, so they really do need a lot of options for that. Immersive teamwork, I've brought it up again. Lots and lots of different design proposals for spaces like this over the past 2 years. Again, I'd be really curious if you're seeing this trend at your institution. And now going back to more formal learning, here are just some examples of those questions again. When I think about formal learning spaces and how we should think about design at this stage, a pilot is still my key recommendation to kind of assess some new hybrid learning models if you haven't already, and then ask students key questions. I always add these to the list. Do you feel more comfortable asking questions in this space versus that space? Ask the virtual students and the in-person students these questions to really understand if they're feeling confident engaging with each other in different types of settings. So some settings that we've done recently, soft seating in the classroom is popular. And as students reported in that Gensler report, smaller groups are certainly preferred, and hands-on learning is certainly preferred. So obviously we don't have the luxury to do this in every high density classroom, but with hybrid learning, there are some interesting options. I know at the University of Amsterdam, their new hybrid learning room is really interesting. They have personal they kind of look like velvet armchairs for each person in the room, and big screens for the virtual students. And it can be rearranged, and there are, I think, standing height tables dotted around the rest of the space. And it's really versatile space. It could also be used for hospitality reasons as well. So happy to dive into small group studios and hybrid learning spaces a little deeper. Makerspaces, this term is always used when talking about university campus design, but it means something different to a lot of people. The key trends I've noticed with makerspaces is that we need a lot of surfaces for whatever students are working on, so a lot of surface area, a lot of new and exciting technology, but also a lot of like blackboards, as you can see on the right-hand side here. So plenty of spaces to be able to pin up ideas, as you can see here, and have a sense of ownership while having access to technology as well. So some old-fashioned ideas there mixed in with the new. And here's another example of what you could call a makerspace. I mean, and we've been putting a lot of biophilia in makerspaces as well, because students tend to spend a lot of time in there. And so they need to feel that sense of ownership, but also they need to feel well when you're spending so much time in a room. In terms of libraries, I've been sort of using the term resource marketplace because it's kind of thought-provoking when we're thinking about the future of libraries. They are, of course, still extremely important to a university ecosystem. And we're seeing so many different trends, library design. And, you know, being a resource marketplace, I think, is a good kind of description why we need a library and what goes on there. It is the center of device and resource destination of those devices and resources that you just can't get at home or anywhere else. It will continue to be that. And I shared that example of the North Carolina State Hunt Library student desk, where it's kind of like an Apple Store Genius Bar. When you're designing a library, do have a think about which area the student run and which areas are for the real librarian experts and knowledge specialists, and how students navigate that. With this layout, you can kind of see the ratios of focus heads down individual space compared with social space. I'd be happy to send that to you as a thought starter if you're thinking about libraries. I'm doing a couple of library pilots at the moment. Really interesting to see how the pandemic has shown them that they need so many more individual spaces, and to pose the question of how important are acoustics at every level, because I'm sure with most of your libraries, they start out really noisy and get quieter and quieter. Within libraries, because students spend so much time there, I have put in gaming spaces. This is getting more and more and more popular. So if you would like to see more pictures of gaming spaces, do let me know. And there are interesting ways that we've dealt with acoustics, but it is important if students are going to be spending up to 6 hours, which a lot of them do in a library space. They of course need coffee. But they also need a space to completely relax. And so if there's lockers for their things, to just go into a gaming space. I know a lot of them watch others game as well. But anyway, if they can relax, I think that's important. That's what they're asking for. Still getting lots of requests for hospitality and dining spaces. And also a lot of universities, again, in cities, I'm seeing are turning some of their hospitality spaces into co-working spaces. And that is for additional revenue stream, but also to have that kind of organic connection between students and the community, potential employers, maybe alumni. But yeah, these spaces are working harder than they ever have been. So that's an interesting trend. Still getting lots of requests for atrium spaces, which double up as event spaces as well. This, I think, was from Harvard University, but just a nice image, I thought, of sense of ownership, that the students felt they could easily move the seats around, and they, I think this was in an atrium, and they decided to just have a working session there. And I just like that image. So lots of large workspaces are still being asked for by universities, where students can feel like they're working alone but together. Maybe they have their headphones on, but they're kind of hoping that they'll run into a friend, and always, always, always having individual spaces nearby and in view. We do a lot of evaluation on usage, and students do not go to use individual spaces or any other setting that they cannot see from where they are. So having individual spaces and other types of spaces really adjacent to these large work areas mean that students will be more likely to use them. Small group spaces, and as we call them at Herman Miller, havens, so important. Whether you have technology available in these spaces or not, it totally depends on on how you want the students to feel and what you want them to be doing. But students are just flocking to these spaces, whether it's because they feel that with roommates and the buzz of campus, they can't get alone time anywhere else and they just need a minute to relax, or whether it's because they really need to focus and they need to get away from it all and have a little bit of acoustic protection, but not necessarily complete acoustic protection. These spaces are really, really popular. And lastly, jump spaces and what we also call warm-up, cool-down spaces at Herman Miller. So these would be spaces directly adjacent to a meeting room or a lecture hall or a classroom where you might be waiting to get into a room, but people are already in there. But you sort of serendipitously run into some people who you might need to speak with. If there's no furniture there and it's just kind of a blank space, chances are you're not going to spend a long time kind of interacting with that person, or when you're coming out of the room and you're not finished with your chat, but the other class is waiting to come in. If there isn't just maybe a standing height setting, a place where you can put your coffee down and have a chat, will you have that chat is the question. And I would say also beware of putting in furniture in those spaces that is too comfortable. If you put a really comfortable leather couch in that space, it might signal to the other person that you want to sit with them for a long time. So just standing height settings or these chairs on the bottom left here are a great solution. So here is some initial recommended reading. I will send a follow-up email with my slides. I believe there's a video of this as well, and I'm more than happy to meet with you individually or your teams to discuss any of these topics in more depth. There's a lot of research, a lot of reading, as you can see on this slide, and lots of reports out there. And so I would be more than happy to dive into specific topics with you further. So please, I'd love to hear any questions.
Lauren, thank you very much for that. That's really helpful. There seems to be a bit of an echo. Oh, that's gone now. Great. Thank you very much for that. So hopefully you can answer some of the questions. So if you could stop sharing, Lauren, that would be really useful. So you do that at the top. And we have some questions for you. So one of the questions is, how much of this type of research that you're doing has included faculty and their comfort with ever-changing learning environments? Students adjust quickly, as you've already mentioned, but what about faculty?
That's a great question. I think faculty change management is one of the best things you could invest in. A beautiful building can only ever be successful if appropriate change management has taken place with faculty, especially if new teaching practices and new pedagogies are involved, and especially new technology. If there's not a really robust internal communication and internal change management plan, it's just not going to work. So in terms of the research, there were about 400 people involved in that survey that I mentioned, and it was a complete mix of staff and faculty. I'll get the exact numbers for you. But yes, that's post-pandemic, or wherever we are now in the pandemic's journey. But yeah, that's where we are. I'd love to do more research specifically on faculty, but with any project I do, there's lots of change management and pre-occupancy evaluation done with just faculty separately to the students.
Thank you. And as you can hear, Lauren's really keen to connect with anyone. So Bertie, my colleague, will post her email address in the chat box as well. So if you want to send her any messages, do connect. You did kind of refer to acoustics during your talk, but someone's asked, Virginia's asked, how do you manage acoustic problems in those mixed activities layouts you've shown?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you take the library, for example, many libraries have the quietest floors at the top And so when you have individual settings on that top floor, what we're doing at the moment with clients is creating really acoustically tight pods on the top floor. If you have to go and attend an online session, you don't want to disrupt anybody else on that floor. So really acoustically protected. But the bottom floor, it's okay to have a bit of background noise, and that's expected, and you go there expecting that. Most students report that they're okay with just having some noise cancelling headphones if they need to really focus on the bottom floor, but they kind of want to keep an eye out for other students that they might want to work with. So there's a complete range of acoustic options. I'd be happy to send you examples, but from fabrics to acoustic pods, there are so many different options, and each setting has different kind of atmospheres. So at one library at the moment, there's a mezzanine level that's a little quieter than the ground floor, and you're able to, with the same products and the same settings that you have on the ground floor, create even more acoustic protection. But the goal isn't on that floor to have complete acoustic protection for many reasons. I don't know if that answers your question, but there's so many different ways that you can achieve your acoustics goals with various different settings.
Thank you. I certainly have seen some doing it with kind of protocols that they're almost library areas, not quite the traditional libraries, but quiet areas.
If you put books, we've done this in a couple of places, if you just put bookshelves with loads of books that you don't expect the students to actually look at, but they infer you should be quiet. And if you call in, signage is so important. And I think some universities I worked with had really interesting journeys with signage, where some were too harsh and they had to change it. So they had some signs up saying, be quiet, do not disturb, and they changed it to be a bit nicer, like this is a great setting for individual heads down work, to suggest a behavior as opposed to being too bossy.
Great, thank you. Another great question from Jennifer. Are you seeing a need for storage lockers for hybrid or for transient workers or students?
Yeah, of course, and of various sizes, and I think there's no perfect size depending on who the user is. But yes, lots of different storage locker options, and storage lockers that also kind of are multi-purpose. So some you can kind of design-wise, you can kind of hide them underneath a surface that you might be using for project work, and that might extend out to be a cafe height table with stools. You know, storage units way they can be out in the open and have multi-purpose use.
Great, thank you. And of course, a lot of modern lockers you can start using hands-free as well with some of the
exactly. There's so many options for that. So many options, yeah.
A couple of questions around hybrid learning. One person said it would be really great to have a session to understand hybrid learning. But another question is, are there any studies comparing the levels of productivity and sense of engagement in a hybrid class amongst students who attend the lessons online and those who are physically present, and whether one or the other requires additional support or attention post-class?
I would love to read that report. I'm sure people are working on that, and I'm keeping my eye out for a report that robust at this stage. I think now, this upcoming term, this term that we're in now, and maybe next term, could be the best times to assess that. I don't think that last year was a good time to assess that because most people were just online. But this year would be the best time to assess that. And I think we can guess what some of the outcomes would be. Gensler's education index that I've referenced a few times does say that most students say that they get more out of being on site, and when they are on, more out of being hands-on and in small groups. And most students, when they were fully online for a year, felt that they were academically quote unquote failing compared to where they were previously. So that's an indicator, but I think this year is the time to do that research. I don't know if last year was the best time to do that research.
Yeah, and I guess there's a follow-up from here that says, can you point to any work on the designer experience of the virtual versus in office? But it's probably too early.
It's a bit early, but I'm going to put feelers out. I mean, I'm keeping an eye on a couple of people who I think might do projects on this, and certainly save my email address and pester me for this because I'm looking for that information too.
I've got a question for you, Lauren. Are you seeing any mistakes that you want to scream at people, saying don't do that yet, or
Yes.
or are there any myths out there that you kind of think, why are you saying that? That's not proven? Or
Yeah, and we're seeing this in the workplace too, where people are so hungry for collaboration because of being in isolation for so long that they don't put in any individual spaces because they are so excited to make offices a collaboration hub that they don't put in any individual spaces. So then people don't come in anyway because they know that they can't come in and have that heads down experience, even if it's just for an hour that day. Of course, we want to come into a workplace or any environment and have a collaborative and social experience, but we also do need the individual focus. So we are kind of at Herman Miller, I know, with various clients kind of thinking, oh gosh, if they don't put in any individual spaces, this is going to fail. So.
Great, thank you very much. This has been really insightful. So just to let everyone know, there will be a follow-up email tomorrow. Lauren has very kindly agreed to share her slide deck, so I'll share that as a PDF with you guys tomorrow. There'll be a follow-up email with all those links that Lauren's talked about as well. You've got Lauren's email, but that will also be in the link tomorrow. Do feel free to connect if you want Lauren to speak at any of your events or work with you. Do connect with her. And as you leave this event a little bit in a minute, when I close it, you'll be sent to a website, which seems really strange, but it's just an assessment. It's a Survey Monkey where you can give Lauren either high scores or very high scores, is what she told me to say. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Lauren, that's been outstanding. I don't know if there's anything that you want to close with or add.
No, thank you. And just a reminder, you know, these are all considerations, only some formal research, but really open to hearing what your experiences are and constantly evolving this presentation. So please get in touch to let me know what your experiences are.
Great, thank you, Lauren. And all your applause is actually in the chat box. It doesn't come in the sound anymore, so it's all in the chat box. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us from all over the world. The video will be online, maybe by the end of the day, but probably by tomorrow. So thank you very much, everyone.